the moral, the ethical, the intellectual, the astral, the cosmic, the celestial, house not made with hands.
The alchemical axiom or principle of vitriol. Visita interiora terrae, rectificando inveniis occultum lapidum. Visit the interior of the earth, and rectifying therein, you will find the hidden stone.
You know, if you don't transmute yourself first, you will transmute nothing.
The axiom of fixing the volatile and volatilizing the fixed.
Being able to weave hermetic principles into our social fabric.
Filling in the fractal spaces till we get to the most rarefied abstract plane of the celestial realm.
You know, that's alchemy, that's understanding nature.
Question everything.
Symbols are far beyond words, right? Symbols are the touch point where the mind enters into the sublime, incomprehensible, translinguistic depths of a direct connection with the ultimate that I would refer to as the divine.
There is truth in the Western esoteric traditions. It has been contributed to and refined and evolved over the course of millennia by what we can conceive universally to be the greatest minds to ever exist.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Philosophical Minds Podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric. From the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all, join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception, while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right. Tonight, I'm joined with C.G. Dahlin. He studied philosophy, culture, and language at University in Athens, Greece. Completed bachelor's and his MFA in the States. Though his degree spanned the humanities at large, his academic publications and conference presentations were grounded in comparative religion, poetics, and or historical cultural analysis. He's held leadership roles in, am I pronouncing this right? Sanghas?
Oh, it's Sanghas. Yeah.
Sanghas,
yeah.
Non-denominational pagan sanctuary, and has fulfilled the role as director of religious education for a Unitarian Universalist fellowship. Besides all that, he's got an amazing YouTube channel where he puts out absolutely amazing, detailed, long-form content on all sorts of esoteric subject matters, religious subject matters. It's great. I love it. I'm a fan. That's how I found you. So I'm super excited to speak with you. Is there anything additional that you would like to add about yourself and your background?
No, I think that's very comprehensive. Both the scholastic and the religious institutional background, as opposed to just one or the other.
Beautiful. All right. And so I was thinking a good opening question would be, what is myth? Myth versus religious legend versus folklore and so on. Go ahead and just answer that however you wish, because I think that'd be a good starting point for this whole conversation.
Myth is allegory and is a vessel for wisdom to transmute between generations and over the expanse of time. Myth is a device for the conveyance of wisdom. Since there is no better device for it, we call it myth instead. That's the most succinct answer I can give to that question.
And so I would say that there's an opinion about myth that it's contrary to truth. Others would argue that myth contains potentially higher orders of truth. I wanted to ask you about truth and do you believe there's like a hierarchy? I think, guys like Jordan Peterson will talk about like there's this like nested hierarchy of truths where like there's like these archetypal truths that persist and reoccur throughout time, maybe in like the Jungian or the Jungian sense, where there are these truths that exist hierarchically and persist throughout time. We all have our own individual realities and our own individual truths, but then there's potentially these higher order truths, and potentially those are encapsulated in myth. What do you think about that?
I've joscillated a lot on this subject, but a tendency of mine is that I've tended more towards a sort of radical subjectivity than
Radicals.
a seeking of the idea of the objective. And I personally find it much more fruitful for people to, or at least at the very least for myself, to seek the truths from radical subjectivity as opposed to seeking something objective outside of ourselves, this kind of mythic otherness. But I'm a humanities guy. I'm not a sciences guy. So accordingly, I would be much more biased towards that end of the spectrum.
All right. Okay. This is super dumb. I feel like I sound really dumb right now. But remind me again, subjective versus objective. Which one is like the personal sort of versus the external?
Yeah, that's the subjective is the personal. So your own experience is the only reality
Mm,
versus there is a reality outside of myself, and I need to get rid of my subjectivity in order to find that reality.
okay. So, and you gravitate towards radical subjectivity,
Yes,
which
I would say
is more of is it more of the collective versus the
your
personal?
personal experience is the reality.
Okay.
And the only thing that comprises objective reality is when we all consent our subjectivity
Mm.
to this other idea, this tulpa or this thought form, this tradition, whatever it is.
So so with subjectivity, if we have a group of people experiencing their own subjective realities, potentially we can find correspondences or patterns within the collective of each individual's subjective experiences. Now, does that mean that it then defines it as an objective reality? Or is this, how would you explain that?
This is a classic yin yang kind of chicken or the egg paradox. I think, at least, at the very least, to speak more diagnostically, I think it's much more important to push the idea of people's own um, credo, of their own subjective realities, than it is right now to push some idea of some great outside force.
Mhm.
In throughout the course, there's been a few times that I've made that argument of the logos, as it's put in the mystical tradition, or the Holy Ghost, where there is a voice outside of time that is attemptedly guiding. So for the animists, this would be the ancestors, or the Sky Father, depending, or Great Spirit or Great Mystery. This would seem to imply that there is an objective thing outside that is informing our subjective realities. We could also answer that as being constituted by the whole collection of subjective existences that have since passed from this world. It's kind of Jungian unconscious constitution logic. So, yes, there is a chicken or the egg thing here. But if we are to go about understanding, for instance, where my camp is, if we're going to understand the magical tradition, or if we're going to understand the animistic tradition, then we have to come at it from a subjectivist inclination in order
Mm,
to actually be able to comprehend that subject matter in a meaningful and wise way.
yeah, I think I would agree with that. Yeah, I think that otherwise you're sort of forfeiting your own consciousness in some way to the external, which would kind of lend credence to the valid nature of the, or at least the value of the esoteric versus the exoteric nature of things. Okay,
Mm.
so Zoroastrianism, the Magi, the Magians, perhaps. I wanted to ask you first, are the Magi a product of Zoroastrianism or separate but contemporary? Or how do you kind of piece all that together?
The only effect to that that I can speak of is their ancient role. I can't speak to its lineage into the present, but the ancient magi or the priests of the Zoroastrian, not just faith, but also the empire as it was seated in power, were, in my educated opinion, let's just say, uh, the ultimate concrescence or like the greatest embodiers of the many magical techniques and traditions of the ancient past that go well back into our animistic history. So, techniques learned from shamanism, integrated in techniques as they were being advanced and cultivated across the Fertile Crescent, across that whole era into Babylon, so forth. These techniques, whether divination, dream interpretation, astrological sophistication, very advanced astrological sophistication. All of these uniquely and most advancedly inherited by the Magi. So they would have been the greatest embodiment of this, let's just say, flavor of knowledge that has since been either intentfully or unintentionally destroyed.
Mm.
Um, and so the last kind of full embodiment or vestige of this ancient knowledge, a great example of the loss of this sort of material is the Library of Alexandria, classically.
Mm.
Um, so that they, to me, were the greatest indication of all the things that we can't see from the past, all the levels of knowledge gained throughout early civilization, they came to be. And then after them, a big washout, which the Islamic Golden Age is a testament to how much of that was in the soil, was in the midst of the culture.
Okay. And then, so do you believe that the Magi, as they existed historically, has continued in some modern day iteration? Or how
I've
would you?
heard, I've heard such things, but I've never been able to personally corroborate that.
Okay.
I've never been able to look into that yet.
Yeah. And so these techniques learned from shamanism and so on that you speak of, I know, well, I know with Zoroastrianism in particular, they have like the Avesta. Is that the right name? I think it's called the Avestas. Uh,
Hmm.
Now are the Avestas, does that include information about the nature or the practices or the function or the role of the Magi, or am I getting these conflated? Is this like a separate thing or?
I think a good way to make this interpretable to someone who's unfamiliar is the Avestas are going to be more like uh let's just say the Talmud. Well, no, let's just say there is the classical books of Christianity, that which is canon, and then
Mhm.
there are other things, let's just say Apocrypha, or the Dead Sea Scrolls or something. Very
Mhm.
loose analogy, but the Avestas are going to be the body or the scripture, as I understand it, for uh, Zoroastrianism as a belief and as a faith. The techniques of the Magi, as I understand it, were initiated and taught. They were not put down. Although, if you go into the Avestas, you'll see a very, very sophisticated account of astrology. and ancient understanding of astrology. So there is a mixed bag there. I think this is particularly telling if you ever dig into the Book of Giants and the Book of Enoch. It does the same thing, where the astrology in the book is absolutely advanced beyond its time, and fascinating accordingly. Uh, so that's as far as I understand it. I think this is a priest class, like at least speaking to it in the ancient sense. This was a priest class initiation that is more likened to a secret society initiation than it is to a open exoteric availability in scripture.
Okay, and then so since you mentioned Enoch, I was actually curious to ask you, isn't there like two different Enochs historically, like
There are
biblically or something?
many books in the Book of Enoch. It's kind of like a bit of a grab bag of these different books that loosely agree on the premise of Enoch's ascendancy and his story, and also agree with that Manichaean or Gnostic narrative,
Hmm.
and thus why the Bible doesn't play very well with them traditionally, although there are exceptions. Uh, so you could say that there is the biblical Enoch, or the very scant references that you get in the canonical Bible, which are very few and most are in Genesis, I believe. And then there is the apocryphal, or the external to canon Christianity Enoch. Um, and if you read just the biblical, it leaves a lot to be desired. And so if you read the Apocrypha, then you really get that fleshed out, that curiosity, that the Christian doctrine canon naturally distills.
Yeah. Okay. And then so yeah, I was trying to. So there's a particular story of Enoch where I, he like metamorphosizes into Metatron or something along these lines. And
There,
so,
yeah, there
yeah.
is I'm not entirely sure where that connection between Enoch and Metatron is substantiated. From my readings in the Book of Enoch proper, it is clear that he ascends. And so, in the same vein as Jesus ascends, or in this time of the ancient past, then how Orion ascended, or how Hercules ascended, how they become transubstantiated or constellationed in the heavens.
Mm,
Um, and so, to be given that designation of your story is concretized in the heavens is literally ascending into heaven. And depending on what we interpret angels as, are they luminaries or constellatory, or are they purely disembodied metaphysical attributes of the universe? That all depends. So, angelology is also a whole different curveball to throw into
oh, I'm so
deconstructing.
fascinated with it right now. I saw that you did an episode on the celestial hierarchy, and
Oof, yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't finished that one yet, but it's really interesting to me so far. You know, cherubim, seraphim, the thrones, the powers, all these various. It's a lot, but
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, in my opinion, it turns usually when people get a hold of this subject matter, it turns very, un in my mind, I'm always interpreting this as allegorical and as symbolic in the vein as I believe the ancients always spoke.
mhm.
And so much of the time, those who handle the material like to literalize the angelic forms, as though they weren't symbolic. And so that's my distinction. That's like my jumping off point. Um, but yes, the it is entirely possible, which that's like the second session I ever did in the course. Still super rough in my presentation because I was doing that as a job at that point for like Zoom calls.
Mm.
Um, and I would like to come back to that and make it cleaner. But just to make the point that it is entirely interpretable through the lens of ancient historistic symbolism. as opposed to literalism. And I believe, which I will eventually do once I have the time, that revelations can also be completely deconstructed through astrotheology and through ancient allegorical symbolism.
Mm.
So, hot take, but yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, there was also an episode you did on like Canaanite polytheism, I think it was. And that one was really cool. It's you were kind of dancing around this notion of, L and all these variations of L and all these different um depictions of or words for God, I guess,
Hmm.
exclusive to Canaanite uh religion,
Hmm.
but maybe shared with others as well. But I thought it was cool because these are questions and things that I've wondered about, when researching like the original language. I guess it would be primarily Hebrew when you're researching and looking at these Old Testament texts where they're speaking of like what it'll say like Elohim or El Shaddai or Aloha or all these different things. And then um I'm like, well, these are like something's different about them. I mean, the names are different. So, but yeah, maybe it'd be cool if you could like elaborate on a little bit of that and like what you have come to find with these different god names and what they all sort of mean or
Yeah. The something that I feel like is very important to point out is if I was talking to someone who is, say, for instance, Maori, or if I was talking to somebody who's Aboriginal, or if I was talking to someone who spoke the ancient Aramaic and who lives in this culture that has cultivated this scripture, this belief system, what have you, there is a substantial issue that's hard to express to people of what's called transliteration.
Mhm.
The need for that culture to create words in order to answer the questions that are being brought to them. They have an entirely different macrocosm. They have an entirely different microcosm. They have an entirely different reality and cultural basis for understanding this given subject material. Okay. So then the task of actually understanding this source material, given our divorced and dejected standing in comparison to them, introduces a lot of chaos and introduces a lot of potential misunderstanding, open air and open mystery. And really, if there is a point to that session, it is to introduce that mystery of this idea as we project onto the idea of God or Yahweh or El or what have you, is in fact much more complicated and much more well-rounded and much less straightforward than certain people would love for it to be.
Yeah.
And accordingly, the idea of whether or not this is true monotheism is genuinely an open question.
Hmm.
uh, the claims of a consort to Yahweh, the question of the original deification of El, warrior deity or deity of metallurgy, how these things became married, and where they got married and what was happening in this uh, syncretization of different deities. And the Old Testament is a lot trippier in this question than I've ever seen anybody give credit. Why is God admitting the presence of other gods and saying they're not real gods? What are they then? There's a lot of and when is Elohim plural? These are
Mm.
earnest questions that only introduce the mystery. I don't think we can fully say hard and fast things about it other than um, mystery.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
that it should be greater questioned than it is, and it's much more intriguing than we might otherwise assume.
Yeah, I remember reading the Old Testament, kept coming across Baal, and it seems like there's definitely this like competitive thing between Yahweh and Baal. And so if you're I guess if you're somebody who gets sort of indoctrinated into the common Christian denominations where they will kind of just keep things at surface level, they'll give you this sort of explanation of Yahweh being the highest, anything else being antithetical to the right, the true and the one God, or so on and so forth. And but yeah, I don't know, like what do you think about that? Like what's your opinion on these different, like what, yeah, Baal was like was he another storm god or something like that, or
Yeah, I also gave a lot of I think the relationship between Jesus and Baal is much more one to one
mm,
than
interesting.
than Baal and Yahweh or God, other than the some other things that were taken. For instance, the Leviathan
Mm,
part for God, as it was Lotan for Baal, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And so it gets a little messy, like take this piece over here and take a handful over here for God and that for Jesus. Um, but anytime you're trying to trace these things, if you want to be myopic and you just want to stare in at these two specifically, then you'll get certain answers. But what happens is you can't get the full picture without blowing it out, without looking at the greater, say, in this story, the greater Mediterranean and what's happening with deity in the greater Mediterranean. Um, Atonism as a great instance to like this question of the coming of monotheism or the idea of monotheism. Um, the change from the polytheism of the Canaanites to the monotheism that we all recognize, I've argued, it's just an argument, that it was politically driven.
mhm.
This was a means to unite different peoples to kind of go about it the same way, to follow the same king or to follow the same political zeitgeist of that era. And this happened all the time in the ancient past. For how many Egyptian gods the Greeks would just kind of, bring in to kind of better their relationships with one another. This was kind of like royalty, where you would, send that wife to go marry that husband to make it all better for these two people. This was done with deity. And I believe there's something to be said about marrying these gods together, not literally, not consorting, but merging them together for a political drive and to bring
Yeah.
about a kind of kingdom. So it would have been very important to keep people from butting shoulders with each other since it's all their God, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a buddy of mine was describing to me this sort of like esoteric understanding of Yahweh as like tetragrammaton, as the demiurge, and then this like evolution of Yah y, y, Yahweh YHWH versus, or that would be like Yod He Vav He versus Yod He Shin Vav He, and then the
Mm.
insertion of the Shin being like the insertion of the Christ sort of thing, and then how it was like this Christic dissension into the demiurge that then was this new dispensation, and this is like sort of this understanding around esoteric Christianity. And I was just like, it's kind of blowing my mind, but it's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's you're definitely at that point dipping your toe into Gnostic cosmology
Mm.
or Manichaean cosmology. And in truth, we would love to go back into this period and say this is what it is, right?
Mhm.
Like this is what it is. But the question isn't what it is, it's a question of when.
Mm.
When is it? So the conversations of what God is time variable. So if we are in that 200 AD forward period, then Gnostic cosmology was very emboldened. And so to distinguish the God of the pleroma and the God of creation would have been the much more in vogue, let's just say. Um, and that God in the Garden of Eden, as it is distinguished from the God of creation before all of creation, again with the aeons and the pleroma, would have had more traction.
Mm.
Um, and did have more traction and continued with the Manichaeans well after the Christian church completely slaughtered the Cathars or the Waldensians.
Waldensian. Yeah. So this is it kind of leads into so I wanted to talk with you about like serpentine spirituality, and then you mentioned earlier the Leviathan, and there was this particular recording that you had, and it was discussing, I think it was like
The snake
apophysis.
the snake
po-
worship
yeah, like
episode.
apophysis to Leviathan to Satan, and how you sort of connected this. And so was apophysis, was that like an Egyptian thing or?
Swallows threatens to swallow the sun, and if people the sun, this the sun, it's what threatens to swallow the sun, or as in Revelations, the serpent at the feet of the Virgin.
So is this like
Um,
Yaldabaoth? Like I've seen these Gnostic depictions of the snake with this lion head, and then there's like the sun. I don't know if it's threatening to swallow the sun, but I'm just kind of guessing as you're speaking.
So, Apophis is specific to the Egyptian cosmology
Okay.
and is threatening to swallow the chariot of the sun. And if people stop worshiping um, in the ways, if they stop keeping reality fed and perpetuating, recreating reality, then the serpent will swallow the sun and everything will end. Um, I personally, I don't believe there is anything conclusive to say about serpent symbolism
Hmm.
unless you're focusing specifically on just these cultures or just this culture. As
Yeah.
soon as you do what I was doing, where you're going to Mesoamerica, where you're going to the Aboriginals of Australia, where you're doing the whole thing, it is confounding what
Hmm.
has been done with this symbol and what you could say this symbol could mean.
Yes.
So yes, there is a classical depiction of the demiurge with a snake body and a lion's head. In my mind, this is very chimeric allegory. So then what culture initially made this sigil and how did they understand this snake symbolism?
So like this
Yes,
is the thing I was thinking
yes,
about.
yes, exactly.
Okay.
Um, uh, I have not yet um, devoted myself
Yeah.
to unpacking that demiurge symbolism. I have given myself to the history of the idea of the demiurge. Um, and that was, I believe, Heka to Hecate,
Uh,
from Ptah to the Demiurge. And that was a session called Magic and Creation. I think it would have been made about 2 years ago.
hmm.
You
I think
can track
yeah.
that would be very interesting viewing if this is an interest. I haven't again, in that I don't deal with the symbolism of the demiurge, but I'm sure that will come up because Gnosticism isn't going anywhere. People are neo-Gnosticism is very much um, been emboldened from Theosophy into the New Age, and I think as more books, hopefully, and these dilapidated, scriptures in jars somewhere in the desert continue to keep manifesting. It will be a developing story. But to give spark notes, The demiurge only later, the later idea of it was that it was evil and was that this is a prison planet like system.
Yeah.
In its initial, it was very much the creator in a more beneficent or ambivalent sense. The negative attributes came later, and then you're lost in the investigation of what is the history of the idea of evil, which is a whole another attribute. The one
Yes.
last thing, I don't want to rant, but one last
Oh,
thing.
go ahead.
In the Bible proper, I guess that's what I'm here to do.
Yes.
In the Bible proper, the snake in the garden at the beginning is never given designation as Satanas or as Diablos or as the antagonist or the adversary. It's just the snake. So what we project onto that and who we project that to be is up for us to decide. The canonical Bible of itself does not uh, tell us in the way that people assume that it is the antagonist or what have you. If we were Gnostic, then no. If we were Manichaean and or Gnostic, then we
Manichaean.
would believe that snake is a form of Jesus or the first Jesus or Adam Kadmon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so one of the I mean, interesting, fascinating things in particular, like the dual nature of the serpent. And that's something I've come across because I've kind of become super interested in researching the subject of the, serpentine spirituality or the snake in terms of religiosity and historically, and coming across you can find it like with like Asclepius you have this like very like medicinal moral integral sort of it's fascinating because you got this like in the Hippocratic Oath you have this you're swearing like as a physician to Asclepius and uh Hegia, which is like
Mhm.
and panacea, like hygiene and panacea and all these gods and goddesses where you're swearing to fulfill this oath of uh, doing no harm. That's like a thing, like to do no harm. That's like a common Hippocratic understanding. And I don't know. Anyway, what was I saying? Uh, the dual nature of the stake. So yeah, you find it in good and you find it in evil, and you find interpretations historically where people are depicting the snake as evil, even with it like the Garden of Eden. You'll find stories where they'll say the serpent is evil, and then you'll find other, maybe Gnostic interpretations where the serpent is the good guy or whatever. And so it's just like this fascinating it's this fascinating thing where it's like almost interpreted both ways and it's like who's right or who's wrong or maybe neither nobody's right or nobody's wrong, but it's like up for interpretation.
In just the canonical Bible proper, for Moses to put down his staff and for the snakes to be set upon it and to heal the people, when apparently not just long before the snake was a really bad thing. Even in that classical text, there's contradictions on this affair. One of the interpretations that I found most provocative is, of course, energy or duality. And so the classic serpentining serpents as one, an allegory for DNA, or two, an allegory for yin and yang, the dualistic interplay of the world. It's especially evocative because of the kind of hermetic axiom of as above, so below. The fact that we're not, in fact, a solar system that's stationary and everything's rotating around it. No, the sun is being pulled and everything is twinning, spinning around it, almost like this caduceus or almost like this rod of Asclepius.
Yes.
And so energy there is something that is objectively, huh, uh, I both good and bad depending on who is controlling or what it is doing, right?
Yeah.
Negative and positive. Uh, so in that way, accordingly, let's just say base. That's the symbol. Accordingly, all manner of depictions of this thing that in fact means energy will be contradictory and will be seemingly paradoxical if we don't have that codex. But that's
Yeah.
just one. I did really appreciate the snake as a symbol for the soul, which isn't as common, but the footless one was an old idiom for what they would call the soul because the soul wouldn't leave any tracks. It's not manifest, it's not physical, it's ethereal or what have you. And so with the snake, it doesn't leave any tracks, the footless one. And so, as a kind of one-to-one allegory, I found that one very interesting as well.
Definitely. And like so in like the Corpus Hermeticum, there's a particular segment that includes Asclepius, or there's like an Asclepian dialogue or something along these lines where um Hermes is kind of like superior, or at least, Asclepius is depicted as a disciple of Hermes, learning about spiritual and philosophical medicine and so on. And it's interesting because Hermes and the symbolism that's associated with Hermeticism and Hermes has always been revolved around this sort of not not the rod of Asclepius, but the dual
Caduceus?
the caduceus, yeah. And so you got this caduceus, and then you have this depiction in the Corpus Hermeticum of Hermes being sort of this teacher of Asclepius, and Asclepius having the symbol of this rod of Asclepius, which is also a snake on a rod, singular, but it's sort of this like lineage of this serpentine nature. And, either way you want to spin it. And so I don't know, it's super fascinating to me. And another thing in particular that I wanted to like discuss or talk about that I think is super awesome, is super interesting, is these like Asclepian temples that were run by the Therapeutai, where they had the like these like priest positions, and they had these like designated areas, I guess, or whatever, called the Encomet what was it, like the Encometerion or something, where they had
Hmm.
these like underground dormitories where they had these sleep chambers. And in these sleep chambers, there were like sacred sleep chambers where individuals would go. They would kind of undergo this like initiatic purification process, and then they would have like these sacred couches. I forget what the name of them were, but they would go into these uh states of incubation, this dream incubation or something. And it's called like encomesis or something.
Hmm.
And they would receive these visions allegedly, and there's all these accounts of these visions of these people going to the Asclepion, or these versions of different Asclepian temples, sleeping in these sleep chambers where they were primarily underground, receiving these visions. Sometimes they would come in contact with the god Asclepius. They'd receive these visions and these dreams. Then the Therapeutai would like be there. They were like the priest class or whatever that would interpret these dreams for them. And sometimes they would prescribe particular herbs or whatever. And they would be like, or sometimes they would just have like these miraculous healings based off of their dreams that they would undergo in these incubation sessions or whatever. But it's just fascinating because it's like it's a more psychological, individual, uh I'm sorry, subjective, what's it called? Is it subjective or objective, where it's
No, you
individual?
got it. You got it.
Okay,
Yeah.
subjective. Yeah, it's like this individual gnosis of something that's being realized through a particular state that's being induced by the circumstance, in these chambers or whatever, where they're coming into contact with maybe it's their subconscious, whatever it is. Regardless, they're undergoing this sort of miraculous healing or this understanding of something that's wrong with their biology or maybe their spirituality. And it's more of like a holistic understanding. I don't know. I just find it fascinating, and I just wanted to bring that up. But yeah.
I think, I mean, sound therapy, as it was very sufficiently understood in the ancient past of creating these chambers for harmonics, that was inherited by the institution of Christianity well into their choirs and such, and seems to be something we just don't know how to do acoustics anymore. So that's something to bring back, I think, a great renaissance to these underground dark tunnel acoustics.
Yeah.
Also, the Pythagoreans and the Mithridites, those that followed Mithras, would worship in caves off the coast. So there could be some mutual speaking to here. I also know when it came to the greater Greek or Asclepian practices, the practice of controlled poison via the snakes as not just a healing, but almost like if you just take a little bit of belladonna, it will send you into the heavens. Witches flying with the belladonna into the heavens. Uh, and this controlled dosage or the attempt to bring yourself as close to death as possible in order to bring back wisdom, which these practices go all the way back into the shamanic past. And this usually would be reserved for the medicine man, whether it be a practice in Siberia with the Amanita muscaria mushroom, what have you. This space, not just the acoustics, but also the initiations, the herbology, the doctrine of signatures, uh, and the use of snakes yet again as an interesting motif or as an access to the divine potentially. There could be a method missing there that would be very fascinating to uncover.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about who is Faens. I think I heard you discuss him in the cost. I think it was in the context of your Orphism and the cult of Dionysius.
Mhm.
But yeah, who's Faens? Where in history is Faens depicted or described or talked about? Who was he? Like what is the symbolism around that? I don't know if this relates, but it's just
Oh,
a side thing. I
no,
just wanted to talk.
I love obscure deities. That's my bread and butter. Phanes is the protogonos, and that means the firstborn, the one who emerged from the Orphic egg. That was the beginning of creation. Phanes etymologically means light. So if we were to describe the morning star and call it Lucifer, then all it's really saying is the light bearer. So that action in the sky is given a name and is given characterization, anthropomorphization, what have you. So if we observe that and we say Lucifer, then in the same way, when light was believed to be born in the universe, thus Phanes, but also the symbolic attributions of all of creation. So the snakes that are around Phanes, again, I tend to interpret that as energy, energy as light, light as a manifestation of displaying the universe. He's naked, which I think is pretty obvious. This is very authentic and very bare. This is if you shine the light on something, the truth of it is made bare. So Fanes is habitually naked, accordingly. Um, Other attributes I'm not remembering off the top of my head right now, but as a specific device, he is much more divine seeming in his symbolism than most firstborn deities. We don't usually get this kind of abstract symbolism that we get in the Orphic creation story that Fanes comes from. Normally, the firstborn, like what, if it's Christian, then it's just God, or if it's Sumeria, then it's Abzu, but was he even born, or were they born at all? Um, this is easily one of the more mystifying firstborn in a cosmology, Fanes. And I think it's extra fun to consider the etymological roots that use that. So, for instance, photons use the same etymological root as Fanes because it's
Mm.
light. That's what photons are. They're light. So there's a lot of speculation you can have there about does was perhaps this initial creation of Fanes birthing from the Orphic egg actually the propulsion of photons escaping the singularity that is the egg at the beginning of time? You know, there's all kinds of heady things that you can do to wrap that one around.
Definitely. Yeah. I was while you were talking, I was looking up there's this thing I was writing on because when we were talking about Asclepius and the dual nature of serpents and um medicine and so on, it's interesting because when you look up the term drug,
Oh.
I started doing this like this thing that I'm working on where it's like elaborating on like that subject. So this is like Oxford 2024. Any substance that affects the structure or functioning of a living organism. Drugs are widely used for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of disease and or the relief of symptoms. Uh, Concise Oxford 1919. Original simple substance, organic or inorganic, used alone or as an ingredient. Black's Law 1910, page 399. Uh, Substances used in medicine, any substance, vegetable, animal, or mineral used in the composition or preparation of medicines. The term is also applied to the materials used in dyeing and in chemistry. The thesaurus, strong matches, cure, medicine, narcotic, pharmaceutical, pill, poison, prescription, remedy, stimulant. So it's like, this is crazy because when you look up drug, the word drug, you have this contradiction because you have it's either a poison or it's a remedy or a cure. And it's like it reminds me of this serpentine nature of this like dual nature of something that can be beneficial or it can be harmful. And it's like, the Paracelsian line of like the dose becomes the poison or something along those lines.
Hmm.
But it's just so funny how people throw this word around and maybe they'll be like, "Hey, you should stay off of drugs or you shouldn't do drugs." And it's like, what does that even mean? Like, you shouldn't do drugs? Drugs under the definition, which definition are you talking about? Are you talking about you shouldn't do drugs under the definition of something that's healing or beneficial for you? Or are you talking about drugs under the definition of it's a potential poison? But it's like the definition of the thing itself is potentially both. And I don't know. I find that so weird and interesting and fascinating and um funny like when people talk about it because people talk about it based off of what they hear other people parrot about it or whatever, but you actually look at the definition of it itself and it's like has this dual nature. So I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, to restore the balance. If you had too much yin, then you need a little bit of yang, right? So that center pole that the snakes are wrapping around is this kind of hypothetical balance or this
Mm.
perfection that we seek.
Yes.
And so accordingly, sometimes to reset our balance, a poison needs to be introduced. Or this was also the seeking in alchemy for a very long time, to try to find that drastic yin to like ascend this yang, um, to seek that balance. Um, yeah, so that's another interesting interpretation of the caduceus as it was more historically understood, ancestrally understood. I'm not entirely sure if anybody thinks about it too much, especially in the medical field. Um, this this symbol and where it's inherited from, and what is that? What is that? Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super fascinating. Okay, so like you've got on your channel a wide variety of subjects. I mean, you go into different Sumerian mythology, different Canaanite, Christian, Gnosticism, Egyptian, all this, all kinds, everything. What are for you yourself? Do you have any like particular subject matters that are of particular interest that you feel offer some sort of value, some sort of insight that isn't found commonly in other religions or other mythologies that you gravitate towards? Anything like that? I'm curious.
So a few ways to answer that. One, my interest is what you see on the upload schedule. Like, uh, I am, in fact, quite the curious and insatiable person in this regard. I am most interested in the collective story of humanity as a unification and as a like greater distillation. One story is not enough in my um, seeking, in my quest. Uh, However, not speaking for myself, because I find it very hard to speak for myself.
Mhm.
Because
Me too.
normally when you get are in this space, or you are given these kinds of subjects, people want to know how you identify or what your loyalty is. And I think the benefit I bring is because I don't have that loyalty. If I
Hmm.
did have that loyalty, I would bring up this information and then at the 11th hour try to swoop you in with a conversion. I am not, I am not, that's not what I'm interested in. And I hope I always stay that way, because normally these subjects are much too loaded with weird agendas.
Yeah.
And I want to, I will to not have that agenda and to not become beholden, but to continue to offer it this way. Anyway, that said, I do think there are specific traditions that are of a particularly beneficial or remedy-like nature to the modern person. And so the question there isn't what the truth is, but the question there is, if I go to believe this, will the benefits be better than if I go to believe this?
Mm.
So not thinking of it as a seeking of the truth, but as a life choice or as a better way of being, a more sustained, harmonious way of being. And in the modern world, with this hypochondriatic, frenetic, yang, 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 yang energy, then anything that brings in a feeling of acceptance, any yin or any balance, or that everything is okay,
Hmm.
is a remedy to assert that balance.
Mm.
And Christianity, as an example, is a guilt complex. Whether no matter how you cut it, there is a guilt complex.
I mean,
And that makes you have to
primarily,
do
yes.
things. You have to do things in a guilt complex. Whereas, for instance, if we were Taoist. Now, I'm
Yeah.
not talking about the religion, I'm talking about the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzhou. If we read the texts, the original texts, and we wish to follow that, that is a yin, and that
Mm.
is a remedy to this age and to this time, and is ridiculously fascinating.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
uh, and easy to engage with. Whereas so much of the time, religious scripture or religious doctrine gatekeeps itself or is too steeped in its own language to be easily accessed without substantial pre-study. Um, and in this case, it's like poetry.
Mm.
Very simply worded, approachable poetry,
Okay,
ruminating poetry.
I want to ask you a question about Taoism. Uh, Oops, hold on. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if my microphone popped off. But so traditionally in the Western systems, esoterically, we've got the four elemental system, earth, air, water, fire. Taoism, we've got the wood and the metal.
Hmm.
I don't know how much you've kind of like looked in or wrestled with this or like looked into this or what they offer to you in terms of value, but I just want to ask you anything in particular that stands out. Um, have you found value in incorporating or looking at these uh these differentiations in terms of Taoist cosmology, or I don't know, would it be called cosmology? Um, but yeah, with the wood and the metal, this different elemental system and how things flow together. What have you found? Like, what do you find interesting about that? Anything?
The only time I dug into that substantially was to study the alchemy sessions that I did, because the East was a significant contribution to the history of alchemy. Um, uh, so in that, I think a good comparison that might be a bit ham-fisted or reductionist, but a good comparison is we have the horoscopic astrology of the West, and we have sidereal of India in that greater area. And these are two different systems that would seem to contradict each other, but instead they are just a different language to approach that study with. If we want to understand the alchemical tradition or the inherent esoteric or religious or spiritual iconography and symbolism of the East, then we have to be able to go forth with this system. So I think of it more as a language or a means to like approach that material, then I think of it as like something super intriguing of itself.
Mm.
I think of it as a means to engage with
Yeah.
that other material, as opposed to, well, oh gosh, whose team am I on? Uh, you know, so yes, yes. I don't have much more to say other than that. And I appreciate that there are these different forms of approaching the elemental world. I think it's far too easy for the West to think that it's only ever been this objective way that they've created, and that that's all that there ever is and all that there ever will be. And I like that there's an antithesis, like an antithesis to that. I like that there are alternative answers, that shows the potential plurality. And hey, maybe we want to come up with one. Maybe we want to throw plasma in there at some point. Maybe we
Yeah.
want to start making alchemical charts with that in it.
Well,
Innovation and novelty abound.
yeah, it's cool. It's funny because the last interview I had, I was discussing with my guest this sort of thing about sewing symbol sets and how, we there's these various systems with these different symbol sets that represent, some of them may have more or less in certain areas of different symbolic meanings that give meaning to different things in reality or whatever.
Mm,
But the importance is that somebody uh at least familiarizes themselves with some particular symbol set in order to allow their subconscious to sort of engage with their conscious, with, say, whether it's with dream work or something like that. And I
mm,
remember I listened to you had an episode with another guy where he was kind of asking you some questions about dreams, and you're like, well, I don't know if I can really answer that question about your dreams because it kind of depends on your perception of these particular symbols. Something along those lines. I don't know if I'm saying that exactly correct,
Nice. That's
but
a deep cut. Nice find. Finding that.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
But it's like this thing where we develop, whether it's with Hebrew, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the symbolic associations that they have,
Mm.
whether it's with various different archetypal things depicted throughout different myths and various cultures historically with the Greeks or with the Egyptians or whatever it is. These different symbolic, Kabbalah, these different symbol sets that can, once we familiarize ourselves with them, allow us to have some sort of dialogue and interchange between our conscious and our subconscious that is like the bridge that allows us to exchange information and understand in our conscious what our unconscious is revealing, or you know what I mean? Know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. It makes me reflect on my dream languages.
Ah,
I was a palmist for many years, and so I've had dreams where my palms have relayed information to me in the dream. Of course, that's not something I could translate to others. The one that I always found most fascinating in that was, you know, not just the symbols, but the totems, the animal
oh, yeah,
totems.
yeah.
And with that, that's always when I've happened across that, not just in my living world, or my dreaming world, as they are distinct.
Yeah.
Um, I've always wondered about these encounters with a pronounced animal. And it makes me remember when I have encountered that animal, or it makes me go inward and ask myself what I have experienced in the presence of that being.
Yeah.
And that brings it back to the subjectivist leaning from the beginning, was that's not a question we normally ask. We normally want to go to this external tradition for them to tell us how we feel and what that means to us.
Yeah.
Instead of like not to sound snooty, but like for instance, if you're like a into wine and you need to savor, you want to experience that flavor instead of looking at the description on the bottle to tell you what you should experience. Or if you're in a sangha, the Buddhists have a practice that you don't take in anything, you get as zen as possible, and then you have some tea. And you take your time with that tea. You experience that tea. You ask yourself, you actually do that inward thing. What is that to me? What
Mm.
is that to me?
It's more
And
authentic.
that's the practice. Yes, it's a
Yeah,
much more I don't like the word because of what they've done within the corporate space, but mindfulness approach.
definitely.
Yes,
And
yes, yes, yes.
okay, so I want to ask you this with Taoism, because it's funny because you have this. I created some diagrams at one point. Me and my buddy were doing this episode on Taoist alchemy where I don't know if it was an astrological thing where they have the wheel, there's like the tiger, the bull, whatever, these various animals, all real animals, and then
Mm,
there's the dragon.
mm,
And people are like, some people are like the dragon didn't exist. Maybe the dragon is maybe it's a myth, maybe it's a figment of our creation. But I just thought it was interesting because all of these historical, whether it's the Bible, whether it's Taoism, whatever it is, there's these depictions of the dragon. Maybe it's myth. I don't know. I'm curious what your opinion is. I don't judge you for either thing. I feel like there's something to the dragon. I don't think it's crazy to believe that there's like the serpent, flying serpent. I mean, we have like what? We have pterodactyls, right? Like that's pretty similar to a dragon. I don't know. But anyway, I wanted to get your opinion on like dragons or like historical.
I did. It was pretty early in the course where I dedicated myself to like a explanation of the vampire, a explanation to the werewolf, and if anybody's curious, that's the shape-shifting and chimera episode
Mm,
area.
I saw
That
that
session,
one.
that session for me is one of still to this day one of my favorites in regards to like my breakthrough on that.
Okay.
Um, but there has been times in the course where I've hypothesized, for instance, recently in that deconstruction of ancient aliens or alternative answer to the ancient alien hypothesis, how the Bigfoot or Yeti iconography or legends, cryptid could be an inheritance of the Gigantopithecus or the Neanderthalis as it was mutually experienced by mankind. So I do think there could be instances of long withheld stories of ancient species as they get mythologized through the living tradition. However, however, with dragons, as another explanation, um, in the Bible, you get these references to fiery serpents quite often.
Mm,
And that is etymologically not the cherubim, but the seraphim. They are seraphs, fiery serpents. There is a trope in the Eastern and Western world of fiery serpents deep in mythology. Now, there's also the rainbow serpent, the oldest account of serpent symbolism,
oh
or one
yeah.
of the oldest in Australia, which is the could be the river as its serpentines, but it also could be the nature of water and thus rainbow, right? The sky and the water it brings. So thus the rainbow has something to do with sky, or water that comes from the heaven to give all the life to the earth. Point being, we also could also say lightning.
Lightning.
Lightning as its form, as this form from the sky flying with destructive fire potential.
Mm,
These higher divinities or deities or powers beyond ourself in the unknown that is the sky and the heavens, something we've never been allowed to transgress on, um, that lives up there and that breathes fire. Um, it's another possibility. It's interesting that the East takes on the iconography of the dragon more often than the West, because I think the West had already used its kind of like grab bag for mythic grab bag. It was already spoken for, like with Zeus, with Odin, or the Allfather, or the Dagda. Like they were lightning, so we
mm.
couldn't have the dragon as much anymore. Whereas in the East, that lightning was still an open question, mythically speaking. Thus, more dragon iconography. Again, I never want to present anything in what I do in my sessions as like, to anybody who doesn't believe this, you're a sullied fool, and this is the only explanation. But I find that this is an interesting explanation, and it's a potential explanation. Although I've already spoken to other explanations, I do like that idea of like an alternative, because the fiery serpent could also be the venom of the snake
Mm.
and its corrosive attributes, and how you die, you boil up if it bites you. So we could also just say that's a snake thing. My previous statement's all wrong. So
Either way, fucking
either way,
great.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I love your perspective and I love your like in-depth analysis. It seems like you when you research something, you do it from a generally like a super holistic perspective where you look at different variations, different potentialities, and you kind of conglomerate some sort of synthesis of potentialities around a subject. You talk a lot about the different potentialities, what's associated with everything, and it's fantastic. So this was a great joy for me to talk with you tonight. And I'm grateful for you taking the time. Is there anything fun, interesting, exciting uh, anything you want to throw out there. Like, it doesn't even matter if it's just like a story or if it's just personal. If you want to, throw out your channel, whatever. Anything additional to put out there for closing thoughts for the listeners that people should be aware of, or that's just fascinating to you in particular?
Wow. Um, yeah, I think as a morale statement, because I don't normally in my channel or in that space, I don't normally get to talk about like motivation or
Mhm.
like what the mission is and what I hope it provides, because I put a lot of effort in for no reason other than, for one, my own selfishness, because I am compulsive and
Yeah.
I want to seek. But that would be one thing for myself, but to also want it to be disseminated and to want it, I don't get benefits from that monetarily. This, you know how it is.
Oh yeah, for
Small
sure.
channel. You're putting effort into this. Why am I doing this? Blah
It's
blah
a
blah.
You're doing a mate, dude. I'm like, wow, this dude's putting in like
A lot of effort.
way more than needed. It's amazing. It's a gift. Like, thank you.
Uh, And the mission there is what I hope to see in the world and what I hope to instill. And if you are a seeker, like you want to look at the alternatives, you want to comprehend the world differently and to genuinely get novelty, an earned perspective as opposed to a given perspective, then you have to earnestly give yourself to the study. And I wanted to provide this. I want to offer this openly. And the right people are people that aren't unlike yourself, that are curious, that do wonder. And yes, it also gravitates some very people that I don't necessarily want to find it as well.
Of course, that's always there.
That's the nature of the medium, and the nature of the subject matter, of course. Um, but it's just to say that my only morale is that there is a great mystery. There's a great wonderment still very much living. And I think too often in the modern world, we are sold the idea that this is all accounted for and that this is the ship and we're just strapped in, yada yada. And the what I hope to provide is no, there is an open field here. There's a whole other way of developing and recontextualizing our past and everything. And it's not harebrained. It's not me being a wackadoo. I'm I'm I That's what I want to instill and provide as a morale. So that
Beautiful.
would be my closing statement.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't get too caught up in like one thing or the other. Sometimes there are various conspiratorial things with a lot of like esoteric subject matters, which are all, you can throw out a mention. This is a potentiality, but it's not like you get too honed in and focused on. You just kind of keep to your own personal, like, here, I'm looking out, I'm looking at the information, I'm looking at it from all these different angles. This is the information that I'm given. These are the things that are potentially at play here. And here it is. And like, I just love that because it allows the individual to be able to absorb the information and then sort of decide for themselves. It's not like you're you're promoting a particular agenda or anything like that. You're just sort of trying to look at things and discern reality from what we have. And it's beautiful. Okay, so aside from all that, where would you direct people to learn more about yourself, your channel, your website, whatever you got out there?
As of now, I am pretty dark on the internet with exception of my YouTube channel, but that depending on when you see this interview, it's more than likely there will be a website. That I do additionally have a Buy Me Coffee um uh site. It's like Patreon, except they just don't steal as much as you from you as Patreon does. Um yeah, yeah. Support the little guys. So that in that space, it's just exclusive commentaries on what I'm making when it comes out, and a much more informal involvement with the process and additional information. So either the Buy Me Coffee link or engage with the YouTube archive that I've assembled and will continue to assemble. And yeah, stay curious.
Hell yeah. Yeah. Check out the YouTube, subscribe. Also, I recommend the Buy Me Coffee. It's similar to Patreon. There's a little bit of exclusivity there with different content that you can receive. I think you have like some different commentary on things. I appreciate you so much. I just want to thank you again for taking the time. This was awesome. So yeah, thank you, man. And maybe potentially in the future we'll do another one, but so thank you.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.